So we are now live.
Right. I'll fill up my water bottle.
Nice. I turned down my YouTube. So, ready to roll?
Ready to roll, buddy. What are we talking
about? So hello to you all, and thank you for joining another episode of Wine and Viticulture Education. My name is Gus Gluck, a London-based wine bar founder and professional taster.
And I am Dr. Dylan Grigg, Australian viticulturalist, who you know may know me from my Insta handle, Dilla.
We've started this little channel to share our passion. Our objective in this series is to kind of bridge the world of wine consumption with its roots in grown grapes. Topics will be wine ranging and most likely quite nerdy, as there is no set script, but you, the audience, are encouraged to throw ideas and opinions into the mix as we tease out and chew the fat on some trendy and not so trendy topics. As a disclaimer, this is not a scientific but is instead an insight into what a sommelier and a viticulturist would and should talk about over a beer. And today it's clones,
which it sometimes can fall into the nerdy category pretty quickly once you got me on the end of it, Gus. Sorry.
That is true, but for someone like me, it's kind of like quite important when you see the end product, because it can like change the style of the product. Like you can sense it in wine, and once you do experience it, it can be glaring. But what about you, Dill?
I guess for me, clones are really interesting because they're like the finest resolution. So you can have a variety planted in a vineyard, and in amongst there can be different clones. So it's the same variety, but individual vines may have these slight nuances. So it's the finest resolution of the way that the vine grows. So if you've got an eye for it, it can be pretty wild.
Actually, and can you give us a quick recap of last week and tell us a bit about clones, if that's all right, Dill?
Clones. Yeah, that's why we chose to go into this week, because last week, you remember, we talked about rootstocks and the need to use American roots to graft European Vitis vinifera scions on top. So we had the variety that we wanted, but the rootstock could handle the calcium nematodes or number 1 phylloxera.
Yeah.
Now, when we get into grafting onto rootstocks, this happened in nurseries. And if you're putting an American vine, that's a rootstock, which is also a clone, and you're putting your own variety on top, you want to be sure that you're going to get a good junction and a good connection. And you also want to know that what you are growing is going to be true to type. So that's where we enter clones. You can take mass selection, which is like selection massale, where you take any cuttings, any buds you want from a vineyard and put them on a rootstock. But in a commercial nursery or for a big vineyard enterprise, the variability that you get maybe isn't desirable, because nurseries want to guarantee and certify what is going out so that it's true to what's advertised, what's written on the box is what you get, but also so that you know that it's free of virus. So you're not planting a vine with a leaf roll virus or a virus that's going to infect the rest of your vineyard, your neighbor's vineyard, and the entire region.
Interesting. So do you need to like choose a rootstock to match the soil and site?
Yeah, I guess that's where it gets tricky, because you've chosen a vineyard site and then you need to choose your rootstock, which last week we talked about. There's, like 30, 80 more. There's so many rootstocks you can choose. So you got to choose the rootstock to match the soil. Then you choose the variety, which in Europe with the appellation system, they've got a long history of testing and loads of knowledge that they can look back on to choose which variety is going to go there.
Yeah.
Then you've got the clone, which is kind of another expression of the variety. So you've got your soil interacting with your rootstock, interacting with your variety, and then you've got the choice of clone. So yeah, it's pretty important.
Yeah, no, it's so like how does like a clone kind of come about then?
So clones are, so when you've got varieties, so Pinot Noir or Nebbiolo or Syrah, that's the variety.
Yeah.
Now, because we don't propagate these vines from seed because they're not true to type. So the definition of a clone, which is a vegetatively propagated plant that's propagated from one mother. So it should be identical to the mother. So when we talk about mother vines of Pinot or Shiraz, then that's the one vine that gave rise to the shoots that provided all of the clones. So, so when people want to choose a clone, they'll often do a lot of tasting or a lot of testing to look for variability within a variety. So, you know, if you talk about, let's just talk about Pinot and Chardonnay, they've got intervarietal variability. One's red and one's white, and they've got completely different genomes. But within Pinot Noir, as an example, there's a very high intravarietal genetic variability. And that is what we exploit to give rise to clones.
Yeah.
So I think
Pinot, so Pinot's basically a fantastic variety because it has so many family offshoots as well. And does that help that? Because obviously it's got, so there's like the mutation that's like Pinot Gris, Pinot Meunier, like does this help create more clones?
Yeah, well, I guess it does because each different color variant can have its own group of clones. So clones come about because we want to guarantee the quality and we want to guarantee the variety that we're working with. Yeah. So, you know, in especially in the European system, you've got Pinot, so you need a guarantee that you're going to have Pinot. But each time that you take a cutting from the mother vine and plant it or graft it, and then you take another cutting from that vine, there can be some somatic mutations as that vine grows. So they can kind of move away from being exactly like the mother. And that's what I mentioned before, that intravarietal genetic variability, which is mostly stable. So sometimes you'll actually, they're called sport buds. So every shoot has a node which has a bud, which is going to grow a new shoot for the next year.
Yeah.
If you get a little freak mutation in those, sometimes you can have, you know, you put down a cane of 10 buds and you get one that has a white bunch, whereas the rest all have red. So there's been like a point mutation at the point that dictates the anthocyanin accumulation or the color of that. So that's called a sport. So if you cut that and take it away, cross your fingers that it's stable, then when you propagate it, you've then got a new clone, or if it's much more different to a clone, it's a new biotype of that variety, which is pretty cool.
Wait, so what's the difference between biotype and clone for the layman?
I think they're kind of interchangeable, you know, clone / biotype. But if we let's try this share screen thing again this week.
That's actually mad, by the way, what you just said. That's pretty amazing. That's pretty amazing about that kind of how, because, and I've seen that before and I didn't really know when I was very young, because I saw it on Santorini and there was like white bunches, red bunches on the same vine and I didn't really understand.
Yeah, you've got to be careful because when I was working in Catalonia, I would see white grapes and red grapes on the same vine on 60, 80-year-old bush vines.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, this is amazing. You know, Grenache Noir, Grenache Blanc, these things are mutating like crazy, even white and red Carignan.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until, I think I said a few weeks ago, there was a story where I was out in the vineyard with an old guy and he was saying to me, oh, no, the grafters would just put whatever buds they could find in. And I'm like, whoa, okay. I thought it was a mutation, but it was actually different varieties grafted on the same vine, which was proven when I found a vine which had Grenache and Carignan on the same vine.
That's pretty cool.
But
Okay,
anyway,
so what are we looking right now?
Okay, so what we got here, this is a study of 53 Grenache accessions or vines. Now, Grenache has different names depending on whereabouts you are.
Yeah.
So if we look at where my cursor is, these are all Grenache.
Yeah.
So your question is, what's the difference between a biotype and a clone?
Yeah.
Now, over here, my cursor's in Spain. These are all Grenache vines from Spain that are grouping together based on genetic similarities.
Okay.
And in the middle, you've got French Grenache Noir. And over on the right-hand side, you've got a split of the Italian accessions. So you can see that they group as by biotype, and within that are the clones.
Wow, look at that.
So in this picture, you've got all Grenache.
Yeah.
Then, depending on where it's from and where it was propagated and where it was grown, and they took cuttings and accumulated mutations, and it went through this genotype by environment interaction.
Yeah.
It became more similar to itself than the cuttings that were put in France and separated over time, and the same in Italy.
So there's like a very distinguishable difference between those.
Yeah, I got, if we go up to this one, this is Nebbiolo. I'll show you the picture first.
Yeah, that is a really awesome picture. Look at that.
So this was looking at single nucleotide variants. So this was a study that was done basically trying to figure out a molecular way to tell the difference between clones, because we can do DNA testing for varieties, which is relatively straightforward.
Yeah.
But when it comes down to the clone level, sometimes it'll only be a single base pair of the DNA that will differentiate between a clone or variety having a different color. Or what else do we know? In the case of Chardonnay, you know, muscat aroma. You've ever heard of muscat clone? That's one SNP, one gene.
Really?
So, yeah. So these guys were having a look at the differences between Nebbiolo clones, and they were able to separate them into biotypes, which grouped by region of origin. And then they went one step further and tried to see if there was nucleotide variants on the genome that they could use to separate clones.
That is pretty amazing.
Which is pretty tricky. I mean, that's the strange thing about working with clones, is that your standard DNA testing is it only gets down to a certain level. Yes, you can differentiate between clones in a scientific study, but generally they're working with a small cohort, and they're not doing the DNA testing. They're doing like methylation sensitive testing, or they're doing some other more complex scientific method to find out if there's differences between clones.
So what sort of things you should be considered when choosing a clone? Like, is it just a quality thing?
I guess, I know we talk about quality and clones, but this is an evolution. So what should we look at? We should look at making our life easier to get a better result.
Yeah.
So older clones, I guess, I'm not sure, when phylloxera came through Europe, I'm pretty sure it would have been a scramble just to get whatever bud.
Yeah, your white material. Well,
which was probably, go on.
Well, also, it's just like a story which I was talking about with a fantastic Portuguese producer who's in Vinifera in the north, and he actually worked for the government, and he was talking about like their clonal selection is really weird because in the 70s and 80s people were saying, oh well, you've got, as I think it was leaf roll virus was a big thing of all these clones, and they're like, why don't you just change that? And it's the fundamental thing for the growers of the region was like, oh, well, because they make the best wines. So they decided to move against the kind of the factor of saying disease is more important than saying, or sorry, that disease prevention is more important, and instead said quality is more.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point you make, because one thing that you try and look for with developing new clones or bringing new clones into a different country or in the selection process is to screen for those viruses.
Yeah.
But in that case, I think it's the Mendoza or the Mendoza, the Chardonnay clone. You know how in Australia it can have a lot of hen and chicken, so big berries and little berries all on the same bunch.
Yeah.
It's also got virus.
Oh, okay.
But if you were to take the virus out, the resulting clone, which has been heat treated or cleaned, they can often not be as good as they were before, because the vine's evolved or been growing with a virus, and it's genetically or epigenetically, or somehow it's silenced the virus and it can continue to grow.
Yeah.
So I know there's been several circumstances where there's a variety that comes in and then it's assumed clean, but you don't know, or there's, I think, about 80 viruses or more that can infect vines.
Yeah.
And then there's a heat treated version, and the nursery puts the two out in the field, and the heat treated version isn't as good, or it's different than the one that's got that virus load, because sometimes viruses aren't necessarily deleterious. They're not making things worse.
So like in some ways, like it's a massive trade-off. So it's like, do you go for quality or do you go for like an easier kind of viticultural experience?
Yeah, I guess the viticultural experience is never easy, but
yeah, I know, but you know what I mean. Like, so you're not having to.
No. So if we go back, you mentioned the leaf roll. So one of the main things you look for is not having virus, or not having nasty viruses that can spread, that are going to be detrimental to quality. But you also look at other things, like you look at bunch size. So some clones can have massive bunches, whereas another clone can have a small bunch. Or you look at berry size. So in Pinot Noir, I mean, there's so many clones, but some of the clones have big bunches and very tight bunches that inside the bunch, as the berries expand, they can squeeze themselves and pop off and release a little bit of juice, which is just a perfect recipe for botrytis before harvest. Whereas other clones are a little bit more loose, they got a bit more space. So as they're developing and expanding, they've got some room to move. So they've got some elasticity against that botrytis. So that's, a really fine observation, can help with choosing a clone. But if we look back to like the 70s, a lot of clones were chosen for yield. So they're very high yielding. Then in the 80s, there was a bit of a shift away from yield towards quality. In the 90s, again, quality. And now in the 2000s, I mean, we look at quality measurements with such a fine resolution of measurements, with genetics and metabolomics, sensory analysis, that some of these methods are now used to select clones at the other far end of winemaking. It's not about how many kilos you can get in the bucket. It's about what is the flavor profile of the wine at the end going to be like.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, because like and I don't know what your experience of knowing like Shiraz clones and stuff in Australia, because it seems that more stuff is done on like Rotundon and stuff in Victoria, but like, does clone come into those kind of like conversations, or is it more about where it's grown?
I think it goes back to what I said near the start. Was you can choose a clone, but how it expresses is always subject to the genotype by environment, a G by E interaction. So it's the same as rootstocks when we talked about rootstocks. What rootstock do you put in? Well, you choose these ones that we think are going to be the best, but because no soil and no site is exactly the same, especially in the New World where we're still exploring, they're subject to that. So Rotundone, or the pepper character in Shiraz or in Syrah, yes, there are clones that have more of that.
Yeah.
The Rotundone is a defense mechanism, and it disappears kind of like the pyrazines with with temperature and exposure. So you can choose a clone that has more of the precursor to begin with. You go put it out in the Riverland or out where it's, you know, hot as hell, chances are you're not going to get a spicy Shiraz out of it.
No. Also, and yes, what is the Heritage Clone Project?
Heritage Clone. Oh yeah. So the Heritage Clone Project is looking at, that's one in the Barossa Valley where they went around and basically took cuttings from favoured vines from very old vineyards, which were themselves pre-clonal. So
okay,
we talk about clone as if it's perfect one for one, but even the clones that come from Europe or from France into Australia are then propagated here or in New Zealand or anywhere else. So they're actually they're polyclones because they didn't come from the mother. So yes, they're pretty close to type, but they're different. So these Shiraz vines were a mass selection, and they've been in their home for 100, 120, 140, 170 years, and they've adapted to that environment. So the thought is, if you go out and choose the ones that have attributes that are more preferred, then maybe they'll grow well in that environment as budwood or as replanted vines. So that one's a really interesting project. I don't have the the time, but imagine doing a study like that Grenache one. You saw the biotypes. Imagine doing a study on the genotypes of Shiraz or Syrah and compare European Shiraz, Australian, you know, get
pretty
some from
amazing.
South Africa and the US.
Oh my God, yeah.
200 years and have a look at how far they've diverged. I think there was one study looking at Cabernet, maybe it was in South America, North America, and Europe. And anyway, once they got beyond 70 years of age, they were really the biotypes were really quite different, which is pretty.
So being that different, like, and does that work on a sensory level as well?
I think totally. I mean, that's how we test clones, because this accumulation of mutations.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe they're not all good, but if you're walking through a vineyard and you taste a vine that's like really stand out, that's amazingly different, which, I mean, the mutations are so fine that it's difficult to do unless you're working with a variety like a Pinot or a Nebbiolo or something that's or Carignan that really expresses itself. Sure, you might have a difference in leaf shape, but you might also have a difference in flavor.
So, for me, that's what I experienced when I was tasting different clones in the Yarra, because obviously, like Pinot, it feels like it's.
You would have had experience with that in the Yarra, where there's a heap of different clones down there.
Well, I mean, like, it's kind of like, obviously, like MV6 is the kind of the predominant one, which is what's seen as like an old like Pommard clone, but it's kind of taken on its own kind of flavor in Australia and also New Zealand. But then there's like 777, 114, 116, who
they've got MV6 in New Zealand too, don't they? I think the MV6 was from the mother vine from the Busby collection or something.
Yeah,
like
it
that.
was.
It's an old one, but even if you look at those Bernard clones, like the 113, 114, 115, and 777, and some of these Pinot clones, the progression from the early clones, which were some of the D clones, which were more sparkling based, or for sparkling.
Okay.
The evolution of yield versus quality has changed over time. So it's actually really interesting that MV6, being one of the oldest clones, still
can. Vogue.
Well, or did it go out of vogue? It can still hold its own amongst the new kids on the block. Yeah,
no, it's kind of like, it'd be interesting to see it in New Zealand actually, because it's like, obviously Pinot from New Zealand does sometimes feel very stylistically the same, and it'd be interesting to see if that is due to pick date site or more to do with the clone, which I'm guessing probably more to do with pick date, because they can be obviously a bit more alcoholic, a bit darker. While at MV6, for me, sensory and kind of Yarra and stuff would be far more like earthy, darker, moodier, less obviously pretty on the nose.
A little
And like
more,
a really good
savoury,
example,
you mean?
a little more savory. I mean, so a good example would be like for like Mac would be like Hoddles Creek. What's his name's property?
Tony Jordan's.
Tony Jordan, may rest in peace. Because that was 777 on and like 114, I think, or something. And it stylistically was always like a wine. It was a 777. Just 777, and that always felt like it was, and like even and across vintages would always be really like open to drink really early on, like the most open of Max wines. Like, and I always thought like that felt very much like that was its clone kind of like showing through.
Yeah. Well, that was a funny one because the 777, when it first came in the country, so you've got a chance. You can get a mother vine in, which you usually get 3 through quarantine. You can then take a bud and graft it and then grow it, and it takes time to build it up. Or you can send your vine and they can do like this meristem culture, and they can do micro propagation. So those vines, that 777 was from tissue culture.
Really?
So when we do our epigenetic special, I'll talk to you about tissue culture and how there's a divergence from the mother's profile, but then in the same environment they come back to being together. So they can be confused. And tissue culture vines, I've only grown 2 vineyards, or worked with 2 vineyards from them, but they grow weird. But then,
and that was one of them.
That was one of them.
Why did they grow weird?
What about this guy?
Oh my God, yeah. So that was, what was the clone for that Pinot? Actually, I never used that.
MV6.
Yeah, like, and it was MV6.
Tell me, what do you think about the flavor profile of that?
Oh, I always thought it was like moody and closed, and like even tasting it from berry to tank, it would like close down the quickest. It was always like going to be like never give, like as it gave loads early on and had like darker flavors, and then once it was in tank and then into barrel, it would still like really compact itself, like almost like it had like a different form of energy around it. Like it was never going to be like, as it took a lot more time to unfurl.
And it was a little bit, so you'd think it was a little bit different to the other vineyards, which were all MV6.
Yeah, definitely. Why was that?
So then, what if I told you that we grafted this onto Cab Sav roots?
Oh, fucking hell.
Okay. And now those Cab Sav I think there was about 8 different clones. So we had polyclonal rootstocks, which were vinifera roots. We'd never seen a green leaf on it when we put the buds in, and we grafted the Pinot on top. And I'd be very interested to hear from anyone else, if anyone's watching now or in the future, if that Cabernet influence comes through in the Scion above.
Which, with that sort of wine, it kind of did feel like it.
I mean,
it's kind of wild. It's just on a purely sensory level, it feels like it comes through.
Yeah.
Because it never tastes like Pinot. Like you try it and you'd be like, what is this?
Yeah, it was an outlier. It was but it was Pinot it was still typically Pinot, but in a good way. And I think that one's really interesting.
Yeah, but it felt almost far more like it was on its own. Like it felt almost like it was like Blaufränkisch or something unusual. Like, do you know what I mean? It felt like it kind of showed it was, and that's obviously why it was such a personal wine for you and Mac, obviously, and everyone who's involved with that property. Like, has clonal material like changed drastically over the past few years?
I think yes. I mean, we've touched on it a couple of times where we talked about the change really being the metrics or how we measure a quality clone. So there's now a lot of new clones that are being developed, and people hunting in vineyards and trying to really focus in on what will be the future of a variety, and especially with climate change. After a stinking hot year in your dry grown vineyard, if you want to go and walk through it and find a vine that looks healthier, maybe it's a little bit smarter with its water. So We've got it's the only way that we can exploit the variability within a variety without changing the variety, because people know Pinot.
Yeah.
You know, you can put in a completely different variety that might grow better, but they know Pinot. So if you can find a Pinot clone that behaves to suit your site, then, you know, half of it's made, which is the name.
So what do you think is more important to the end product in the end, like clone or environment? So I know it's a horrible question, but
it's that whole genotype by environment.
Yeah.
And I think I've heard people say that with age, so your question is what's better if you plant, you know, is the site going to outshine, is always going to outshine no matter what clone's in there, or if you put a good clone on a shit site, is it going to be any good? I think not. You still need a good site, and with the right clone, it can be a better site. But it's highly subjective. Clones and winemakers, you know, you want to start an argument at a Pinot tasting in Australia, go talk about clones.
Yeah, I know. Actually, and it felt like it was far more of a conversation in Australia than it would be maybe over here. Mm-hmm. But I think that's probably the kind of the luxury of being in a wine production country. Because like, I think that like at a wine tasting, you wouldn't have loads of potentially trained winemakers or people training to be a winemaker, or like a viticulturist who come to a wine tasting, or less so over here.
We also don't have centuries of accumulated knowledge of a zone. Like in Europe, varieties are from an area because they've grown there for centuries, whereas we've had them in the ground for 20 years. So of course we're going to put in like 6 clones and then try and figure out which one's better until we can accumulate enough knowledge to go, look, these ones were all rubbish. I don't know what we were doing. We should have just stuck with the MV6. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then that gets into another complexity of wanting to have different products and point of difference and things like that. But there's a lot of great work. There's a lot of new Italian clones, French clones. There's all sorts of stuff coming in for different varieties, which is really exciting. Yep.
Well, I think that we actually had no one ask any questions today, so I think that they were all very happy with what we said.
or we just straight away blew the nerd scale, because people don't really talk that much about clones unless you're deep in the game.
Well, weirdly, this is probably the most mutual subject for someone who sells wine and someone who grows grapes. Fundamentally, I think it's the one thing that really kind of like combines them more. It on a personal level, that is. Yep. So this was a good episode, really.
Nice. No, I enjoyed it.
Well, I think we should probably end it there. Thank you for everyone who watched today. Oh, Amber did come in with a quick question though. Well, look at that. Oh. But also thank you to everyone who hasn't watched. But Amber said, have you heard about there being lots of issues of viruses in the vineyards at Chateau Reyes?
There are lots of vineyards with lots of viruses. I mean, there's more than 80 viruses, and if they're not controlled by certain management techniques or certain insect vectors that can move them around, they're just going to spread. So I haven't heard in particular, but I do know that in many vineyards there are innocuous viruses, and then there are the ones that give us those beautiful autumn colors at the end of the season and slow down sugar accumulation. So they're the nasty ones. So I guess, Amber, what you're saying is, have you heard of this in a famous vineyard that people would just be dying to take budwood from and spread that around? That's a risky scenario. That's the risk with gumboot cuttings. If you're going to put one in your back pocket and go somewhere, might seem like a good idea at the time, but it could be the downfall of us all.
It could be the downfall of us all.
Drinking.
You had it, but drinking. Well, anyway, again, thank you to everyone who did join us today. Lovely to have you all. And thanks to everyone who has been listening with their time off. We really appreciate it. We're going to keep on trying to make the channel better, and we're going to start re-editing our library so you can watch them all back.
And Gus, I'll say thank you also. I've had some great feedback during the week through other platforms of people that have watched or listened to it in the car or while doing the ironing. So thank you. And I'll just sign off by saying that clones are the key to intravarietal variability. So if there's only one thing you take away from that, it's the expression within a variety.
You heard it there first. Thanks again. We'll see you next Monday. We're not sure what we're going to do, but it could be epigenetics if you're lucky. Thank you very much. Loved you all.
Cheers.